What if I told you that selling your house, putting your belongings in storage, and traveling the world for 13 years could lead to building the most successful business of your lifetime? And that's exactly what happened to today's guest, Gary Arndt, who went from tech entrepreneur to award-winning travel photographer to creating a podcast empire that generates more revenue than all his previous ventures combined. But here's what makes Gary's story different from the typical follow your passion narrative. He failed multiple times. His second company crashed with the dot-com bubble. Travel photography, despite winning him 3 Travel Photographer of the Year awards, was what he calls a horrible business. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, he lost 95% of his income in just 2 weeks. So, how did he turn that devastating loss into his biggest success? And what can his journey teach us about building location-independent businesses that actually scale? I'm Jamilia Grier, your host of Revenue Without Borders, the show for professionals who want to build global businesses and achieve financial freedom beyond traditional boundaries. I've spent my career helping entrepreneurs navigate the complexities of building revenue streams that work from anywhere in the world, and this podcast is dedicated to that mission. In today's episode, Gary shares the uncomfortable truths about nomadic entrepreneurship, the strategic pivots that saved his business, and why owning your audience is more valuable than chasing viral content. Whether you're stuck in corporate America dreaming of location independence, or you're already building an international business and wondering how to scale it, Gary's blueprint will challenge everything you think and know about entrepreneurial success. So grab your notebook because this conversation is about to get real about what it really takes to build sustainable revenue without borders. So, Gary, welcome to the show. Gary, you've literally been everywhere. So when people ask you where home is, what do you say?
Well, as of right now, home is in Wisconsin. And I have not done a lot of traveling since the pandemic hit for reasons we'll probably get into. But before that, I was basically on the road for 13 years.
13 years is a long time. I think you've got me beat on that. And so what really inspired you to leave the traditional path and to start traveling full time?
I was pretty fortunate. I started an internet company in the 90s. I sold it before the dot-com bubble burst. And I started another company, which unfortunately did not avoid the dot-com bubble bursting. Invested in some others. I didn't know what to do kind of with my life. I went back to school for a few years. I studied geology and geophysics. Realized I did not want to go into academia. And I just kind of got this idea to travel around the world. I've always been, I'm not from a family that traveled a lot. We were a solidly middle-class family. We'd go on camping trips in the summer, and that was about it. And I got to go to Argentina in 2005. That was something that was interesting. But in 1999, after I sold my business, I convinced the company that I sold it to, that was a big multinational, to send me on a trip around the world to talk to all their offices. I'd never done anything like this before. So I had a 3-week whirlwind tour, and I went to Tokyo, Taipei, Singapore, Frankfurt, Paris, Brussels, and London. And that was kind of an eye-opening experience. I literally circumnavigated the globe. I did a trip by myself to Iceland in 2000, did the trip to Argentina, and I was like, I think I can just sell my home and travel. I wasn't married. I didn't have kids. I had money saved. Why not? So I told everyone I was going to do this. No one really batted an eye because this is the kind of stuff I did. They just expected it from me. 2007, March of 2007, I should say, I also got lucky here because before the 2008 recession hit, I sold my house and I hit the road. And I sold most of my stuff. What I didn't sell was put into storage, and I put my stuff in a bag and started going west. And it took me from March to, I think it was December. It basically took the rest of the year to cross the Pacific Ocean. I visited a lot of the small island countries, ended up going to Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, before I eventually arrived in South Korea, then went down to Hong Kong. And it was kind of during this point that I realized the earth is really big and that I was not going to be able to do this in a year. And I just kind of kept traveling and I ended up making it a business. I became very well known as a travel photographer, won lots of awards. And that's what I did until the pandemic.
Now, what you're describing really sounds like a lot of people's dreams, particularly, the listeners of this show. A lot of people have dreams of living abroad and traveling and seeing the world. Did you have this plan in mind when you started? I know you said that you wanted to kind of travel and see the world, but did you ever think that it was going to go on for this long?
No, I had no real plan. I thought it would. I told everyone I'll be gone for a year. In the back of my mind, I thought maybe two, but then it just kind of became a thing. And that was what I was known for. And it became a business. I had a popular website. I developed pretty large audiences on social media. But like I said, I had my photography and I kind of got ingrained in the travel and tourism world. And I should also add, I wasn't really living overseas. Like the longest I ever stayed anywhere, I think was 3 months. And other than that, maybe the longest was 1 month. Other than that, I was moving all the time. And a lot of times when people see the glamour of travel, they're just seeing a snapshot on Instagram of a highly produced image of somebody holding a glass of wine and the sunset in some exotic location. And more often than not, I'm staying in a dingy hostel or guest house. All your clothes are in one bag, so it starts to smell after a while. Became accustomed to wearing sandals, which is something I still do today, just so I didn't have to wear socks. And there were all sorts of things like that. So the day-to-day grind of travel is very non-glamorous. That being said, I'm glad I did it. And I had experiences that a very, very, very small percent of human beings have ever had because I did this. But it's not all glamorous. I very rarely stayed in like 4 or 5 star hotels.
Yeah.
Because the cost of doing that, why would I waste all that money to be unconscious in a room when I could stay somewhere for a week for the same amount of money? And so that was kind of my life. I ate street food a lot, anything I could do to make, your money go further.
One thing that you raised, which is really interesting, is the photography side. So you had this skill that you were able to use, which, further kind of let you propel and to continue doing this on. When did you realize that photography was going to be the thing that you did that allowed you to keep doing this?
Certainly not at first. So what I did when I started is I bought a rather expensive camera, like a lot of people do, thinking that this was going to take good pictures. And I realized almost immediately that is not how it works. And I remember I was in Hawaii and I was just looking at the photos on my laptop and I was like, these are awful. Like these are truly horrible. And that started a process that took several years. And I should note, I never did photography before in my life. So I've learned this all while I was on the road. You get a fancy SLR and there's all sorts of knobs and dials and buttons on it. And I learned these do things. They're there for a reason. So I had to go through the process of discovering how to take good photos. And I would look at other, great photographers. I would look at what they did. And I was like, well, okay, how did they do that? How, could I reverse engineer it? And then over time, I realized, I figured all the technical stuff out. And I realized it kind of just came down to, okay, they climbed a mountain and sat there for 3 days waiting for the light to get right. That was really the key behind the photo. But it took time. I was making my images public, which was something. So this is before Instagram and Facebook and a lot of social media apps came out. I was posting a photo every day to my website, and making something public was a really good exercise because, it's up for public scrutiny. And I had to make sure that I was producing something good in order to make it public. And I think that was very helpful. But basically, by the time 2012, 13, 14, I was winning Travel Photographer of the Year in North America, which I won 3 times. And that was all. It was basically from nothing to that. And because I was on the road traveling, I just had tons of opportunity to practice. And being in front of beautiful things always helps.
There's so much that you said there that I kind of want to unpack. But first, it's this process of failing. And, I think a lot of people, when they think about traveling abroad, and, there's a huge push now to be a content creator. and to travel the world, as you've described. I think today people's expectations are, I'm going to go on a media trip or a press trip and, stay at swanky hotels, et cetera. But you're talking about sort of from the ground up and what that actually looks like. And I think it's important to kind of just pause on that for a bit, because there is this expectation today that you're just going to take your iPhone and you're just going to travel somewhere and take some pictures, and that's going to be it.
So with regards to what you said, I was on the road for 3 years before anyone in the travel and tourism industry ever contacted me. I was doing this on my own dime, going to wherever I wanted. I was doing this before the iPhone was really a thing. Literally, the day I started traveling was after Steve Jobs announced the iPhone, but before it was on the market and well before they put a camera in it that was any good. So, and I know a lot of people that started traveling at that time because we all had blogs. And like I said, there really was no social media. And we all agreed that we were lucky to be traveling at this time because it changed our perceptions of how we do it. Now you see people, good example. First time I went to Jerusalem was in 2009, and then I returned several years later. Completely different experience, because the first time I was there, no one had smartphones. Second time I was there, everyone was walking around with their camera in front of their face. Going on press trips sucks, to put it bluntly. Everyone has this idea, oh, it's a free trip. No, it's a work trip. And it's guided, and you can't do what you want, and you can't see the things you want necessarily. I would never want to go on one again, to be completely honest. There are better ways to do it. But yeah, I think that the content creator thing for travel is kind of burned itself out. That's not to say that people aren't successful at it, but if you're going to do it, I think you need to do more than just the Instagram, here I am in a place type thing. And there needs to be some substance to it. And it could be, Anthony Bourdain, everybody knows who he is. I always say he wasn't a travel guy. He was a food guy who looked at food through the lens of travel. And there are lots of different things you can look at through the lens of travel without being travel per se. It could be history, it could be art, it could be investments, it could be food, you name it. There's lots of different things because different things are done differently around the world. Music, dance, whatever. And I think taking that kind of approach will probably go further than just talking about travel. Because even though I've traveled a lot, I don't care about frequent flyer miles. I don't care about credit cards. Those things, I understand. I have one. That's it. It's not something I want to talk about all the time. Going to the place and experience it is far more important to me than how I booked my ticket.
Yeah. I think that's such an important distinction because, a lot of what I focus on is the entrepreneurship through the global lens and not even necessarily travel. Like you said at the beginning, you were traveling and you were in a very nomadic state, whereas some people are like, okay, I'm going to move there and live there for 4 years. It's a different lens. And I think it is so important to talk about that because there is this huge rush of people who want to travel in sort of a recreational space. And, like you mentioned, like, for example, you think of Dubai. All right. I'm going to ask you, I ask a lot of people this. When you think of Dubai and travel, what do you think of? What image pops in your head?
Well, if it's one image, it's probably going to be the Burj Khalifa. But I've been to Dubai. It's been a while, but there's a lot of money there. It's a whole lot of people who aren't Arab. It's this weird mixing pot of people from all over the world, a very small number of Emirati. And that's kind of what I think of it as.
Yeah. And there's that image, right? It's luxury, it's glitz, it's glam. But as someone who lives here, I see that, but the experience, the feel of every day, waking up in the morning, in the commute, it's that glitz and glam gets watered down and you start to get into what are the real life aspects of raising kids here, sending them to school, et cetera. And so I think what you're talking about is really important. It's this evolution of we're not just traveling to travel, we're traveling to learn something about culture or about history or politics or geography and really take in a bit more essence. And I think that's what you've done also with your podcast as well. When you talk about everything everywhere, it's a bit more of a deep dive into those disciplines.
Just out of curiosity, have you been able to visit some of the surrounding countries around Dubai? Like, have you
I
been to
have.
Oman?
Yeah, I have, but I feel like because it's a visit, I'm not I'm I'm getting a hospitality glimpse. I feel as though I'm getting what people want me to see. And to be very frank, I'll be real. Like I am the luxury hotel person. Like I am going St. Regis. I'm going there, because I've got the kids with me, and then that's kind of the experience we have. I may get a side trip to go on the street and get some street food or something like that. But that's probably like a one-off chance.
I always recommend if you haven't been there, that part of Oman that's separated from the rest that goes into the Strait of Hormuz. If you go to the very tip in the Musandam Peninsula, there's fjords there. And if you look at a map, it's a really weird thing. And it's a fascinating place to go visit and do some like land trips around that area. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. That sounds amazing. Definitely a lot to see in that area. And so when you so I love photography too, but I think what you're talking about and you're describing this career, this travel photography where you took time to understand the camera, to understand the business also of photography and the art of it. And then you also had this blog/website that you were building on. As that was evolving, did you realize that you were moving towards that, or was it sort of a natural kind of progression?
It was a way for me to continue to travel. It wasn't necessarily a great business. Travel photography is a horrible business, to be blunt. I got in it at a point where everyone assumes, oh, you're selling photos to magazines. Like, no. I got to meet a lot of guys who were National Geographic photographers, old school guys who have been shooting since the 60s, 70s, have great stories about this stuff. But so many of the outlets have dried up. Almost every travel section of American newspapers is gone. Half to most of the travel magazines have gone under. And the ones that are left either pay little or nothing for photography because they just get stock images from whatever destination, or there are people that are happy to get paid nothing because of an iPhone photo they took and just get credit so they can brag to their friends. So it's a horrible business. And what I was doing online stuff, a lot of these older school photographers were kind of jealous of what I was doing because they were having problems with the industry at that time. And to be also honest, I have not taken my camera out of my bag in over 5 years now. My last international trip was in February of 2020. And I was in Portugal and I got back. This was still when they were talking about China and Northern Italy with COVID. And I just haven't done anything since.
Do you think that's been a result of like the change of what it means to do travel photography? Because certainly technology, as you mentioned, the whole landscape is just different now.
Basically, my business has changed. When the pandemic hit, it basically killed my business. In a 2-week period in March of 2020, my income dropped by 95%. And I, like a lot of people, initially thought that this was going to be over quickly, and it wasn't. And I started doing Zoom calls like everybody was doing with a bunch of higher end people I knew in the travel industry. And they were all saying, no, this is not going to be over quickly. This is going to take a long time. And I realized that I had all my eggs in the travel basket and I needed to think of something else to do. And so that's when I got the idea to do a podcast that was not a travel podcast per se, but allowed me to use all the experiences that I've had traveling around the world. That turned out to be one of the best decisions I've ever made.
So you had this pivot.
Huge pivot. Not the first time in my life I've done this, I should say, either. This is maybe like the 4th reinvention of myself since I became an adult.
Can you talk a little bit about what that feels like? I think, particularly for our listeners, and many of them are professionals that have been, in corporate America for about 15 plus years. And they're like, I'd love to, move abroad, do a business or do this or do that. But there's this gray space. And I'm doing a pivot right now. There's this gray space when you're doing a pivot where you don't know what the hell is going on. At least for me, I can say it doesn't feel comfortable. How did that feel?
First of all, I don't know if everyone is cut out to be an entrepreneur. I think it is fundamentally a personality type more than anything else. And it has to do with your level of risk aversion. I have talked to people who I thought would make great entrepreneurs. very smart people, go-getters in their own right, but the idea of not working for a company and getting health insurance and having all that stability, they just couldn't deal with. I have never had that problem. People all the time have, well, weren't you scared of traveling around the world? It's like, no, I never really thought of it. I've never had a real job in my life. I've always been working for myself in one way or another. So these things kind of come easier to me. Like I said, I think it's more of a personality type than anything else. And also it may have to do with what your situation is in life. If you have kids, if you have a spouse that's making money, that gives you a little bit more leeway to do something else. But when the pandemic hit for me, a lot of it was out of desperation. And so I had to do something. And this is, travel was what I was known for at this point. So the pivot, I came up with an idea. I had an idea for a podcast that I was going to do 2 years earlier. I got artwork made in 2018. I got theme music made, all of it done, but I never pulled the trigger on it because it was going to be like a longer show with episodes every other week. And I did the math and I was like, this is not going to be a viable business. So I sat on it. And then I remember I talked to someone at an event I was at, a travel event, and they had launched a daily podcast earlier. And they were telling me it's like the best thing they ever did. So I thought back to that conversation, and this was in I think May of 2020. I was like, well, what if I changed the format and did this as a daily show? Instead of one big topic, what if I took a shotgun approach? And I did the math. So I was like, this works out much better. And I sat down, I gave it a lot of thought. I had a podcast for 11 years called This Week in Travel, which also got killed by the pandemic with several of their co-hosts. And I took everything I learned and I basically created this would be a show that I would listen to. And I did a lot of research, listened to a lot of interviews from successful podcasters, not just podcasting gurus who have never had a successful show themselves, and realized, okay, I am going to have to do this for about a year and a half. Most podcasters are not willing to stick it out that long. But I envision myself not being successful, not enjoying the fruits of my success, but sitting in a room at a computer for a year and a half. That is what I envisioned. Because I knew if I can envision what the worst part of this is going to be, then I'm not going to be surprised when that happens and I'm not going to bail. And that's exactly what I did. I stuck with it. And about, a year and a half, I was making enough money to cover costs. And then a year after that, things really started to take off. And it's to the point now where this is, internet company and everything else that I've done. This is the most successful business I've ever had. So I think there are roughly 2 ways you can make money from a podcast. The vast majority of them, people have a niche podcast about a particular topic, and they will sell some sort of product or service that they have. That's one way to do it. The other way is to just have a giant audience. And that's kind of the way I went. So my podcast is not a niche show. The name of the show is literally Everything Everywhere, which I should add, I had the name before the movie came out, well before the movie came out, but it covers everything. And every day is completely random and nobody knows what the topic is going to be. It's an educational show, usually something about history, math, science, geography. Like I said, I am able to use a lot of the experiences and things I've learned while traveling, and I often insert that into the show, but it's just kind of random. And the episodes are short because it's daily. It's a scripted show. So I'm writing a 2,000 word term paper every day. And I just read that. And that's the show. And it's become really successful. So basically, with my show, pretty much all the money at this point is coming straight from advertising. And a lot of people, when they think about this, their first instinct is, oh, I should start a YouTube channel. Nothing wrong with YouTube, but the economics of YouTube versus podcasting are very different. You're really reliant on the YouTube algorithm if you have a YouTube channel, meaning you got to have the thumbnail and you got to have the right title and the clickbaity thing. And I've known people that have started YouTube channels that had no success, viral video, and then they realize they got to keep doing that same thing over and over if they want to have the success, because that's not what the algorithm knows. And I should also add, the CPM rates, and CPM is the cost per thousand, what you earn in an ad for YouTube is very low. The best CPMs that I've heard of are around $15, and those tend to be for finance type YouTube channels. And they can go down to like $2 or $3 for some other stuff. So yeah, if you're Mr. Beast and you're getting hundreds of millions of people watching a video, you can make a fantastic amount of money. But for most people, it's going to be hard. Audio podcasting, there is no algorithm, which means you have to grow the show organically. But what that also means is that there's no algorithm. So people often ask like, oh, what shows are your most popular? You should do that over and over. And I'm like, there is no most popular. Because there's no algorithm, everyone's downloading everything and they're listening to everything because that's what the show serves up. You don't lose an audience overnight. I'm sure you've heard cases of people who by accident or for whatever reason, YouTube just shuts their channel down. Like it's gone. This happens like once a month. There's some content creator where it's a mistake. But that's not going to happen with an audio podcast. Audio podcast CPMs, the average is about a $20 CPM, which is above the best one you're going to get on YouTube and can go far higher. I've known of people that have gotten $50 to $80 CPMs for ads with very niche content. So if your audience is big enough, yeah, you can make a fantastic amount. You've probably heard about the Caller Daddies, the Joe Rogans, and these other very big podcasts who have signed deals that are north of $100 million. So basically, once you have that audience, if you have a large audience, which is not easy to do, you can make a lot of money from advertising, but also a lot of other things. I've talked about running tours for my audience. At this point, the audience has grown so large, we might just do like rent an entire riverboat in Europe and get people on there. I can do lectures in the evening or something about where we're going to go or where we've been. I haven't even done merchandise sales yet. So there's a whole lot of revenue streams that I haven't even tapped into just because so much of my time has been spent doing the actual show. Oh, yeah. I've met many people, and you've probably met them too. They want to do something, but they want to wait till it's perfect. The problem is, you're not going to know what's perfect until you do it. And in the case of something like a podcast, your first podcast, by definition, should be your worst podcast, no matter how good it is. Because if it's not your worst, that means you're getting worse, not getting better. So yeah, just start. I don't know if you've ever seen the first episode or like the first videos Mr. Beast ever did. They're awful. They're horrible. Nobody cares anymore because he got those out of his system. The first Joe Rogan episode was horrible. It was just him shooting the shit with his buddies. That's all it was, his comedian friends, and they would get drunk and whatever. It was not well produced. It was bad. I'm sure you've heard like the whole Malcolm Gladwell thing that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert at something. I don't know whether that number is true, but certainly you have to put in reps. And you also have to be self-reflective because a lot of people, when they launch a podcast, they're refusing to say, well, I can improve it or I can make it better because it's their thing. Yet I really think you do have to have that attitude towards anything you do. When I started doing photography, I was extremely self-critical. And I look back at some of my early photos that I thought at one point were good. Now they're awful. I'm embarrassed of them. I would never show them to anyone. And the first episodes of the podcast I do now, I'm thinking of getting rid of them and redoing a lot of them because I'm so embarrassed by them. But that's a natural process. And if you want to learn quickly and I think get to a point where you're achieving some sort of success, you need to have these iterative process of doing and learning to get to that point fast. Because just sitting and thinking about it and hoping that you're going to start it perfectly one day doesn't work. I think in so many things in life, we see the end result and we don't see what goes into it. I remember hearing stories about how Kobe Bryant was always the first one in the gym, the first one at practice, and he was just shooting free throws over and over and over and over, or taking shots. And that part is not on film. We don't see that. We just see the end result. You don't see all the time that actors put in to going to casting calls, possibly hundreds or thousands of times before they ever get a gig. But then they get one and then maybe their career starts rolling and we see that, but we don't see what goes into it. We don't see them sleeping on a friend's couch and that struggle. And a lot of people, because they just envision the success, they're not prepared for the struggle. And almost any successful person you'll talk to has some story of struggle that they had to go through to ultimately achieve what they did. And I think if you envision the struggle, it's going to be a lot easier. because you're going to know this is what I'm going through this right now because this is what everyone goes through and this is part of the process. Hopefully, maybe you'll get lucky. Maybe you'll achieve success sooner. But if you can at least know that that's part of the process, your odds of being successful, I think, in any field of endeavor are going to be greater.
I want to talk a bit about people and culture because I imagine not just through your travels and the amount of countries that you visited, but also through this look at history and politics and everything else that you're discussing on Everything Everywhere, that there's this examination of people across cultures, right? And I'm sure you've seen it as you've traveled and you've gone to different countries. What really shocked you the most about humanity as you traveled? And it'd be interesting to hear what you say because you've been to so many countries. I think you said over almost 200. Been basically everywhere. What really has shocked you?
When you're looking at it from the outside, we tend to look at the differences between places. They dress this way, they eat this way, they drive on the other side of the road or something like that. Good example. When I was young, we took a trip to Niagara Falls, my family. We went to Canada. And Canada, even though they hate to admit this, is basically the same as the United States. It's very similar. But when I was there for the first time, my eyes were drawn to things that were different. Things were in the metric system. Packages would be in English and French, or they would have slightly different candies or things like that. So I noticed all the differences because they stood out. First time I was in Japan, everything is different. You can't read anything if you don't know Japanese. And I remember seeing a 7-Eleven. And I was like, oh, we have 7-Elevens. And I went in, was like, they had all sorts of stuff that was unfamiliar. It's like, oh, then I saw Lay's potato chips. I was like, well, we have Lay's potato chips. Granted, theirs were like seaweed and prawn and different flavors, but my eyes were drawn to the things that were the same. And in the course of traveling, what I noticed is that there is a great deal of commonality around the world. Most people every day are just going about their lives working. The food, they might be a little bit different. They may be driving a motorbike instead of a car. If you go to some big Asian cities like Jakarta or Hanoi or places like that. But the day-to-day life isn't necessarily radically different. Where you live in Dubai, I remember hearing the call to prayer. And I don't know, you know better than me, but I somehow remember Dubai amongst all the places I've been in, like the Muslim world, they were all synchronized, like it was on a loudspeaker, as opposed to just individual ones going off separately that were slightly out of sync. But that's, I think, the biggest thing. I think most people are inherently good. The news sensationalized. Since I've been in some places where there were big news stories occurring, and then seeing with my own eyes what was happening versus what was being reported was often very different. And they report it in such a way to make it sound much worse than it really is. You get people from back home is like, oh, are you safe? Are you all right? It's like, yeah, nothing's happening. I don't know what the problem is. But what they're seeing is like, oh, it's a war zone and everyone's dying. It's like, no, not really.
Why do you think we do that? And I've experienced that as well. I mean, particularly even with my family, when we talk about going to different places and, people who haven't traveled to those places will say things like, oh, well, they do X, Y, and Z over there, so you better be careful. And there's all these myths and stories. Why do you think we do that as humans?
When we're familiar with something, we're more comfortable with it. So let's say you live in a large American city. I would say there's a good chance in the last week, somebody died. Somebody was murdered. However, that doesn't cause people to pack their bags and leave town, right? They know, oh, that was someone who was drunk, or there was some reason behind it, and it doesn't affect them. Yet some American tourist gets killed in Aruba. Suddenly people are canceling their trips because they're not familiar with the place, or they tend to paint it with a very broad brush. Dubai is not the same as Iraq, something you probably know very, very well, but it's the Middle East. And a lot of people, they hear stuff about the Middle East and they paint it all with a very broad brush because they don't know the distinctions. That Dubai is very different than Saudi Arabia, which has changed a lot, but it's still very, very different. which is very different than Iran. One of the best examples I can think of, Sierra Leone had an Ebola outbreak several years ago, and people were canceling trips to South Africa because of what was happening in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is closer to London than it is to Cape Town. Africa is huge, and yet people often paint all of Africa as if it's one thing. And all these people heard was, oh, there's an outbreak of Ebola in Africa, so I'm not going to Africa. And that's ridiculous. If you recall, several years ago, there was a bombing at the Boston Marathon. And I was traveling at the time. And I remember talking to some friends back in the US. And I said, are you all right? I heard there was a bombing in America. And they're like, we live in California. I'm like, well, yeah, but it was a bombing. That's absurd as an American to hear it that way. But that is exactly what we think of the rest of the world. We tend to paint with such a broad brush. Yet we don't do it ourselves because we're familiar with that place. So the idea of confusing Boston and California make no sense to us. But that's exactly what we do to the rest of the world.
Do you think that perhaps your mission with Everything Everywhere is to kind of educate people and inform them of things so they don't make these nonsense judgments?
Oh, absolutely. So I've been doing a series. The episodes are very short. So I've covered all the tiny little countries. And one of the things I've been doing now is going through a lot of African countries. And there are a lot of African countries. But the history of, say, Liberia, very different history than that of some of the countries right next to it. I recently did Ghana, which is I remember being in Togo, right near the border of Togo and Ghana. And I don't know if there was ever a more marked difference between a border of two countries than what I saw when I was there. Maybe Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But the Ghana side was cleaner, everything was nicer than the Togo side. But again, to most people, it's just, it's Africa or it's West Africa, and they don't see the distinction, but there are very significant distinctions between these countries. And that's part of what I want to do, is to let people learn about these things, even if they can come away from it with just, a few sentences of what it is. I think that's far better than the almost nothing that most people know. One example I always use is I ask people what do you think of Colombia when it comes to mind? And a lot of people say, drug lords, cocaine smuggling. That was in the 80s. The problem is nothing has replaced that image in our collective consciousness, because that was in the news, that was Miami Vice, that was all the stuff that's happening. That's not really true anymore, because we only hear bad things in the news. And then I say, well, what comes to mind when I say Oman or Laos? And nothing comes to mind, because they're never in the news. They have no, I'm sure if something bad happens, it'll suddenly be in the news. But, nothing's happening here is not a news story. And so we tend to only think about bad things, which is why I think a lot of Americans are afraid to travel.
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost it's not necessarily, it is a form of propaganda in a way. And I talk about this a lot, is that I never knew as much about the continent of Africa and the different countries until I came to Dubai, until I sat in the region that is, next to it, and had interactions with people from different countries and talked to them. And, this kind of exposure is really what's going to change people's minds, but also shows like yours. And people got to start traveling again. People have got to get out of their comfort zone. And I don't know, how would you inspire, what would you say to someone who's listening to this and is thinking, I don't know, Gary, you sound a little renegade. You lived out of your suitcase. You traveled the world. It sounds a little renegade. What would you say to these people who probably should get out of it?
You don't have to do what I did. That was extreme. I don't expect anybody to do that. But, very early in my travels, the first place I went outside of the United States was Tahiti. And they speak French. I don't speak French. And this was kind of my first time alone by myself. And it was very intimidating. And I remember being afraid to get on the bus because I would be a miscommunication or something like that. And I still don't really speak French, but that doesn't frighten me anymore. You could airdrop me into pretty much any place in the world now, and I think I could get by. I could figure it out. And you'll also be surprised that, people ask, well, how many languages do you speak? Basically just English. And they don't realize that that's become the international language of travel and tourism. You live in Dubai, I'm guessing you pretty much can get by speaking English every single day, and you don't need to learn Arabic. Although you've probably also figured out what the Arabic numbers are because they're on the license plates and such. But
Yeah,
that's just kind of how it works.
absolutely.
A lot of the things you're afraid of are really just a function of experience. And the more experienced you are as a traveler. So if somebody wants to travel, I would say, okay, let's start in the beginner. Let's do a beginner country. Go to England. That's an easy one. Go to Australia. They speak the same language. You don't have to worry about it. Your only concern is making sure to look the other way when you cross the street. It's fine. And then go to a country that doesn't speak the same language, and you can just keep going like that. And you can eventually go to places that are more and more difficult, get fewer and fewer tourists. I think that's the biggest thing. The number of tourists they get will depend on the infrastructure they have, and that will determine how easy it is for you to travel.
As I listen to you talk about travel and I think about your entrepreneurial journey, do you see that these things are linked in any way? Do you think that your risk loving, as we say in economics, the risk loving side of you in business and entrepreneurship fueled your desire to travel? Or was it the other way around?
I think that had more to do with curiosity. I think the having low risk aversion meant that didn't get in the way. But ultimately, I'm a person who has always been very curious. I read about a whole bunch of different subjects. I spend a lot of time reading. When I sold my first business, I didn't buy a lot of stuff, but one of the things I did is I started a massive collection of National Geographic magazines. I have one of the biggest in the world, just because I loved it and I was able to get maps of old places and things like that. And I think that was part of it. I think curiosity is very important for everyone, because if you truly want to understand how other people live and how the rest of the world works, you have to have that curiosity. And I know people who traveled, and I don't know if they ever really got anything out of it, to be completely honest.
Well, I certainly hope that there's someone that's listening to this episode who feels super inspired by your journey to get out of their comfort zone, to travel, see the world, do something. I mean, there's so much to learn through travel, and I think it's definitely understated, but there's a lot more to learn with Everything Everywhere, the podcast, and that's something that people should be tuning into as well.
Yeah, every day it's something completely different. And if you don't like what I'm doing one day, you'll probably find something completely different the next.
Gary, thank you so much for your time. We're going to put your podcast in the show notes. Appreciate your stories, and it has been a pleasure speaking to you today.
Thanks for having me.
Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to today's episode. I appreciate when you guys tune in and the time that you take to listen to the show and support us. And I have one thing that I'd love for you to do that would really help us out, which is rate the show. If you've enjoyed it, make sure you rate it. You can do it on whatever platform you're listening on. That would do wonders for us. And if you really want to be a super fan and really support the show, there's a link below that you can support us and donate a small monthly contribution, which allows us to continue to create great content for you. Thanks so much again. Appreciate you, and see you next time.